Welcome. I am so glad to have everyone here this evening to talk with Kazu Haga. I'm just so excited about this. I'm Reverend Del Hinton from Gwen Oak United Methodist and Arlington Lewin United Methodist churches, and I am the chair of Central Maryland Ecumenical Council and a member of the Baltimore Peace Builders organization. We're here today collectively supporting this talk that we're having. It is an exciting time together. Central Maryland Ecumenical Council is a gathering of well over 9 denominations, an ecumenical gathering in which we are seeking to make the beloved community real. This is part of our efforts to do that. And in doing that, we have joined together with the Peace Builders of Baltimore and trying to determine how it is that we go about life, trying to build peace and find ways to express ourselves in a nonviolent but firm and progressive way. I hope that this evening find that this evening's conversation is beneficial for all that you're doing, both politically, actively, and personally. We have support coming from all over the nation to watch this and participate in this webinar tonight. And this makes us very excited. But even more so, we have our presenter coming to us from overseas, and we're even more excited about that. And as a personal note, he is taking away from his own personal time, for he is newly married and has chosen to be with us this evening. Kazu Haga is the founder of the East Point Peace Academy, a core member of the Ahimsa Collective and the Yet to Be Named Network, author of Healing Resistance and a Radically Different Response to Harm. He is a practitioner and trainer and teacher of Kenyan nonviolence, restorative justice, organizing, and mindfulness, and works with incarcerated people, youth, activists from around the country. He has over 20 years of experience in nonviolence and social change work and has been an active trainer since 2000. He resides in Oakland, California, and we encourage you, beloved, to definitely buy his book, Healing Resistance. Kazu, I am pleased to welcome you to our webinar tonight and turn over the entirety of the next portion of our time together. Just as a note, beloved, we will be taking your questions off of the Q&A and asking those questions after his presentation. Thank you very much. Kazu?
Thank you so much, Reverend Hinton, and thank you all for joining from wherever you might be joining from. I'm imagining it's good evening for most people. It is a little early in the morning for me. I'm calling from Taiwan right now, the traditional land of many indigenous peoples that I'm just starting to learn about: the Ami people, the Atayal people, the Paiwan people, many, many other, actually a pretty thriving indigenous community here in Taiwan. So honored to be joining from all the way here. And let's see, how do we jump into this? I guess I'll start just by sharing that my personal introduction to the world of nonviolence came at the age of 17. I'm one of those few people that I can actually point to the exact date that it happened. It was May 1st of 1998. When I was just 17 years old. I was a 17-year-old high school dropout, just doing nothing productive with my life. And I heard about this thing that happened, that was being organized, called the Interfaith Pilgrimage of the Middle Passage. And it was a project that was being initiated out of the Leverett Peace Pagoda, which was a Japanese Buddhist temple located next to the town that I was living in. And this was a group of Japanese Buddhist monastics, monks and nuns, who were deeply committed to nonviolence and social change work. And they were the type of monastics that didn't stay in the monastery. They were constantly leaving the monastery to talk about the issues that our society needs to talk about. And so the Interfaith Pilgrimage of the Middle Passage was this project where they were going to walk from Massachusetts down the coast to New Orleans to retrace the slave route and to talk about the real legacy and the impact that the Middle Passage and the slave trade had and continues to have in the United States. And I was just a 17-year-old kid who had never done anything like that, but I was just bored and I just wanted to do something new with my life. So I heard about it. I decided to check it out for a week, and I ended up leaving home for a year and a half. I spent 6 months on that journey on the walk, and then ended up spending a year living in their monasteries overseas in South Asia, throughout India, Nepal, and Sri Lanka, studying in their monasteries. And so my introduction to nonviolence was always at this intersection of political action and spirituality. And spirituality is a funny word. It can mean many things. I think for a lot of people, spirituality can mean their connection with nature. I think he would hate the fact that I say this, but one of my favorite people is Neil deGrasse Tyson, who's an astrophysicist, right? He's a scientist. And I actually consider him to be a spiritual teacher. The way he talks about the cosmos, the way he talks about the universe, to me is a spiritual teaching. And so, when I say spirituality, I mean many different things. But if you look at the lineage of nonviolence, it always came at that intersection, right? If you look at the great teachers of nonviolence throughout history, whether you're talking about Dr. Martin Luther King or Gandhi or Dorothy Day or Cesar Chavez or Leo Tolstoy, they were always at this intersection of spirituality and political action. And that's really where the legacy of nonviolence comes from. And so after I came back from that year and a half journey that introduced me to the world of nonviolence, I got involved in social change work right away and became active as a nonviolence trainer. And I was doing trainings all up and down the East Coast, preparing communities to engage in acts of civil disobedience. And I remember doing that work for a couple of years. And at some point, something about the trainings that I was doing was not connecting for me. And I couldn't quite articulate it then, but it felt like we were missing something in the trainings that I was facilitating back then. And while I didn't quite understand it, it felt strong enough that I actually stopped doing those trainings for many, many years. And for about 10 years of my life, I remained engaged in social change work. That's all I was doing. But the word nonviolence was not something that was very meaningful to me anymore. And back in 2007, the fall of 2008, I ended up taking this 2-day workshop on a philosophy called Kingian nonviolence. It's a philosophy based on the teachings of Dr. Martin Luther King. And that 2-day workshop completely changed my life forever. And it was the first time that I realized the depth of what the word nonviolence meant. And it was in that weekend workshop that I understood what was missing in the trainings that I was doing back then when I was a lot younger. I realized that when I was a lot younger, what I was doing was nonviolent civil disobedience trainings. And that's an important component of nonviolence, but it's actually just a small component of it. And so I've been on this journey, on this path since that 2-day workshop in the fall of 2008 to better understand what it means to be a practitioner of nonviolence. Mm-hmm. I realized in that 2-day workshop that the word nonviolence is a big umbrella, right? And underneath that umbrella, nonviolent civil disobedience is a component that falls underneath that umbrella. People may be familiar with nonviolent communication, which is a very particular training in a method of communication and using language as a way to build a better relationship with our own needs and emotions. That's a very specific thing that's under the big umbrella of nonviolence, but it's just one piece of it. There are things like nonviolent intervention, where unarmed civilians who are trained in nonviolence are sent into war zones to try to cultivate peace in conflict areas. That's a component of nonviolence. There's things like alternatives to violence. There's conflict transformation work, even restorative justice work, I think falls underneath that umbrella, civil resistance work. But like when people hear the word nonviolence, I think they oftentimes associate it with things like nonviolent protest and nonviolent action. And I've come to understand that a lot of people who practice nonviolent social change work and are engaged in movement building work, there's oftentimes like a tension between those who believe that nonviolence is a set of strategies that we use to engage in social change work, and people who believe that nonviolence is much more than that. It's actually a way of life. It's something that we're trying to commit ourselves to in every relationship, in every interaction that we have throughout our day, throughout our lives. And I've come I oftentimes talk about how if we view nonviolence simply as the absence of violence during political demonstrations, then one could make the argument that when the Ku Klux Klan holds rallies and marches, that they're engaged in nonviolent action, because at least during the duration of the time that they're in the marches, they're not throwing Molotov cocktails, they're not punching anybody, right? So you could make the argument that they're practicing nonviolence if your understanding of nonviolence is simply the absence of physical forms of violence during a political demonstration. And the idea that someone with a worldview as violent as members of the KKK could attend a so-called nonviolent workshop and learn something that could benefit their work never sat well with me, right? Because like people with violent worldviews that are spewing hatred could come to a lot of trainings where they learn about the tactics and strategies of nonviolent social change and then use those tactics to push forth their violent agenda. And so to me, when we use the word nonviolence, it has to be so much more than just a commitment to not engaging in physical acts of violence while we're at a political demonstration, because you can use that to push forth any agenda. And so I want to share a few things that I learned from my journeys through nonviolence that speaks a little bit more to what nonviolence is not and what nonviolence actually is. So I'm going to share my screen a little bit. And while I do that, I definitely want to encourage people to engage in conversations in the chat. And I'm actually going to be asking for a couple of specific things. And if you look on your chat box, you'll see a box that says hosts and panelists. And if you click on that and click on everyone, then the chats that you type in will go to everyone on this call, and instead of just the hosts and panelists. So I encourage you to click on everyone in the chat, and just give me a second while I set up my screen share. So I think you all remember when we were young, we used to play the Find the Difference games, where there were two images that were right next to each other that were very similar to each other, and you had to circle and find the difference. So this is that game. So as soon as you see the difference between these two images, I want you to put it into the chat box, all right? So what is the difference between these two images? Go ahead and put it into the chat as soon as you see it. The bird in the sky, yep. The butterfly, the purple flower, yep. So there's 3 or 4 differences in this image. So the next one's going to be a little bit more complicated. There's a few more differences. What is the difference between these two images? And again, go ahead and put it into the chat as soon as you see it. The red apple, the window, the fruit, the number of apples, the smile on the pig, yep. There's a few more that might be a little bit harder to see. The pig's tail is missing, the color of its suspenders. So we're going to do one more. What is the difference between these two? And again, go ahead and enter it into the chat box. Yep, the hyphen, right? Non-hyphen violence and non-violence without the hyphen. Oftentimes, people use these two interchangeably, but I learned through my trainings in Kingian nonviolence that, at least from a Kingian perspective, the hyphen radically changes the meaning of the word, and it leads to very dangerous misunderstandings of the idea of nonviolence. Because when you put the hyphen in the word, as some people are commenting in the chat here, when you put the hyphen in the word, it separates the word, right? Non-hyphen violence. All that is saying is something is not violent, right? Something is the absence of violence. And like I was saying earlier, I think the idea that nonviolence is about not being violent is the biggest and most dangerous misunderstanding of the idea of nonviolence. And I want to share two stories about that. This is the view from I just moved out of this place in Oakland, California, which is where I normally live. But this is the view from my kitchen window in the apartment that I lived in for about 12 years until very recently. And it's a beautiful neighborhood. It's one of the most diverse neighborhoods in Oakland. You'll hear 6, 7 languages being spoken just on this one block alone. But it's also a neighborhood that has its fair share of challenges, and you see a lot of conflict, a lot of arguments, people screaming. It's a very rowdy neighborhood. And years ago, I was woken up. I was taking a nap at about 10 o'clock in the morning, and I was woken up by a couple who were arguing right outside of my window. And this was such a normal occurrence in my neighborhood that I was just trying to ignore it and go back to sleep. But this argument kept escalating and escalating. And at some point, I finally decided to get up and look out the window. And right below my window, there was a woman on the ground who was getting beat, and she was screaming for help. So I jumped up out of my bed and I put on my shoes. I ran downstairs and opened up the gate. And by this point, they had gone across the street to the other corner that you see in the picture, and it was still going on. So I ran across the street and I broke up this fight. And by the time that I had gotten down there, about 15 of my neighbors had heard the commotion, and they had all come outside, and they were just standing around watching this woman get beat, not doing anything to help. And I oftentimes make the argument that all of my neighbors who were just standing around watching this woman get beat were practicing non-hyphen violence, in the sense that they were not being violent, right? They were explicitly not being violent. And you could even make the argument that I was more violent than my neighbors were, because in the process of breaking up that fight, I used a limited amount of physical force to pull the two people apart. And I might have injured one of them in the process, right? And so you see how big of a difference it makes when we understand nonviolence simply as the absence of violence. As long as I'm not being violent, then I'm practicing nonviolence. And because our society has such a misunderstanding of nonviolence simply as what not to do, it allows us to justify being a bystander to injustice. But nonviolence, as Dr. King taught it, and all of the great practitioners of nonviolence taught it, it's not about what not to do. It's about, when you see violence and injustice in your community, what are you going to do to inject yourself into that situation and help transform the culture of violence? So nonviolence is not about what not to do, right? It's about what you're going to do. And so if nonviolence is not about simply not being violent, then what is nonviolence? And this is something that even after 20 years in the field, I still have not come up with like a short, concise, like I needed 250 pages in a book to explain what nonviolence is ultimately, because at the end of the day, it's a whole worldview and a philosophy, right? Part of how I oftentimes talk about it is that nonviolence is a martial art. I'm a lifelong fan of martial arts. And I love the analogy of nonviolence as a martial art because nobody has ever come to a 2 day karate seminar and walked away feeling like they understand what karate is and they no longer need to train in it because they've mastered it in this 2 day seminar, right? It's a lifelong practice. You need to practice it like every day, 2, 3, 4, 5 times a week for many, many years before those skills become integrated enough that they become useful to you in a real life conflict. And yet, for some reason, with nonviolence, people oftentimes think that they can come to a 2 day nonviolence workshop and understand what nonviolence is and feel like they don't need to train in it anymore. And to me, nonviolence is like I can understand it in theory. There's a beautiful quote that comes from an ancient Greek soldier that says, "We don't rise to the level of expectation, we fall to the level of our training." So like we can have all these beautiful expectations like, oh, the next time I get into an argument with my partner, I'm going to be nonviolent. I'm going to be calm. I'm going to listen to them. I'm going to try to understand them. And then when you get into that argument, all of that goes out the window because we haven't been training in it in the dojo, right? We haven't been practicing it. If you practice karate, you don't wait until you get into a fight in the streets to begin to practice it. You practice those moves in the dojo every single day, so it becomes like muscle memory. And to me, nonviolence is the same way. It's something that we have to constantly be engaged in the practice of. That's where we got the idea for the name of the East Point Peace Academy, right? It's a play on words of the military academy at West Point because we believe that we have to train for peace at least as much as the military trains for war. And in reality, I think we probably have to train more than the military trains because we live in a society where violence is already accepted as normal, like it's a part of human nature. And so to counter that narrative, we might have to double down on training even more than the military does. Also, like, what does it mean? What does the word nonviolence mean? I think so much of what is at the core of nonviolence is this unwavering commitment to the vision of what Dr. King called the beloved community and to this concept of reconciliation. You know, I was mentioning I used the word spirituality before. To me, at the core of what I mean when I talk about spirituality is like an embodied knowing that we belong to something bigger than our individual selves. That might mean faith in a higher power, or it might mean this like embodied knowing that we are just part of a larger ecosystem. There's a part of the universe, right? That are the atoms that make up our bodies were forged in a star, and somehow that connects us with all other living organisms and with everything else that exists in the universe. And that idea of interdependence, that we belong to each other, that we are part of each other, to me is so much at the core of a commitment to nonviolence. This idea of beloved community, people, you know, when we talk about beloved community, people oftentimes say, oh, well, my beloved community is my church, or my beloved community is my family, or my friends group, or my beloved community is the community of people that I organize with. And I always want to acknowledge the truth of that statement, and at the same time, challenge people to think a little bit more, because I think when Dr. King talked about beloved community, he wasn't just talking about loving the people that are easy to love, right? Loving the people that are already in your community. But building beloved community is learning to cultivate compassion for the people that are difficult to love, right? You can be in a loving community, but building beloved community is about acknowledging that I will never be free until all people are free, until all life is free. And when we say all people and all life, we really mean all, right? Not just like all the people that we like or all the people with whom our politics agree on. We really mean all people, which is incredibly difficult to do because of the prevalence of ignorance and fear and hatred and delusion in the world. And I know that when I see people speaking from a place of ignorance, it can be very frustrating, right? And it can be easy for that to trigger something deep within me that makes it easy for me to other them and to say they're the problem. I was at a Buddhist meditation retreat years ago, and one of the nuns who was leading the retreat said this one thing that will always stick with me. She said that we have to learn to have compassion for people's ignorance. That this word ignorance in our society, I feel like it's become loaded, right? It has this like moral judgment to it. But ignorance in its purest form simply means someone doesn't know something. Like we are all ignorant of so many things. There are so many things that we don't know. We are all ignorant of so many things. And I know that in my path and in my journey, there's been so much that I've learned along the way. And if people judged my lack of understanding about something and people shame me for it, then I would never have had the opportunity to learn. And so, I think it's one of the big challenges in nonviolence is to know that even the people that we disagree with, even the people who are responsible oftentimes for causing the harm, that they are acting out of ignorance, and that we have to learn somehow to have some compassion for that fact while being assertive enough to say no, right? To not allow them to continue to act out of ignorance while balancing having some compassion for that. And I want to share this one quick thing about what it might look like to balance that sort of compassion and assertiveness before I open it up to some further discussion. So I'm just going to share my screen one more time. Give me 1 second here. Here we go. So in our society today, we get upset, which is righteous. And there's so many ways in which we need to be upset. But oftentimes when we get upset, we take all of our aggression, our aggressive energy, and we take it out on individual people, right? And at the same time, like anger is a natural human response. Conciliation, our ability to have empathy, our ability to have compassion and understanding is also a natural human response. And we have this tendency to take our conciliatory attitudes and channel that towards broad conditions. And what I mean by that is, we take an issue like homelessness, and we get angry at homeless people, houseless people, and we say, "You're lazy, what's wrong with you? Get a job." And then we take a look at the broad conditions surrounding homelessness, and we have this tendency to be like, "Oh, I feel so bad for poor people," right? I feel so bad for people who come from broken homes and people who have mental health challenges. And I just feel so bad for all these people. I feel so bad for the children starving in Africa and for all the people. Like, that's us having compassion for these big conditions. And that actually does nothing to change the condition. One of my favorite quotes from Dr. King is when he said, "Power without love is reckless and abusive, and love without power is sentimental and anemic." When we take our aggression out towards people, that gets expressed as rage. And rage is dangerous in that it's uncontrollable and it just burns everything in its path. And when we take our conciliatory attitudes out towards broad conditions, that gets expressed as charity. And charity might make you feel better about the fact that these conditions exist, because look at how wonderful of a person you are. You're giving a couple dollars to feed some hungry child in Africa. But all it does is it maintains the status quo. because it's anemic and sentimental, and it doesn't have the power to change those conditions. So in nonviolence, what we're trying to do is to take our aggression and channel it towards these broad conditions, which then gets expressed as what Dr. King called righteous indignation, right? It's the type of anger that can be channeled in the right direction, and to take our conciliatory attitudes towards the people that are caught up in those conditions, which then gets expressed as agape love, that sort of powerful, unconditional love for all people because they exist, because they're human, because they're alive, and because life is sacred. And it's at this intersection, this X is our target in nonviolence, right? That's what it means to cultivate the right type of anger, the right type of aggression, the right type of indignation, the right type of assertiveness, and to channel it in the right direction. And at the same time, to channel the right kind of love, because the kind of sympathetic love that says, oh, I care so much about poor people, that actually doesn't have the power to change the conditions that creates poverty in the first place, right? So nonviolence is about harnessing the right type of power and channeling it in the right direction. And at the same time, harnessing the right type of love and channeling it in the right direction. And it's when we're able to channel those two forces in the right direction that real transformation is possible. And so these are just some of the lessons that I've learned through my journey in nonviolence, largely through the teachings of Dr. Martin Luther King. But at the same time, I've come to believe in nonviolence as a universal truth, right? As some of you know, I've had a long kind of journey through Buddhist practice as well, and I was at another retreat years ago where the teacher said, the Buddha didn't teach Buddhism, right? The Buddha taught universal truths that emerges through all of the great wisdom traditions throughout the world. And in fact, the first book on Buddhism I ever read was a book by the great teacher Thich Nhat Hanh called Living Buddha, Living Christ, essentially saying that the Buddha and Jesus Christ taught the same exact things. And so, in Buddhism, there's a word called Dharma, which now oftentimes refers to the teachings of the historical Buddha. But the word Dharma pre-exists the Buddha. And historically, the word Dharma simply meant like universal, timeless truths. I think it's similar to the way we almost understand science and physics. Like physics is our way of trying to understand the universal laws that govern nature. And Dharma was the Buddha's understanding of the universal laws that govern like human psychology and our path to liberation. And to me, nonviolence is also that. It's our attempt at understanding the universal laws that govern our relationship to each other, our relationship to harm, our relationship to healing. There are people in this world today that believe that the earth is flat and gravity does not exist. This is a whole thing. I'm actually like incredibly fascinated by the whole flat earth phenomena. There are people who believe that gravity doesn't exist. But at the end of the day, it doesn't matter if they believe that gravity is real or not, because gravity is a universal law of nature, and people who don't believe in gravity are still governed by its laws. And so in a similar way, there are people who believe that you can create lasting peace by using violent methods. There are people who believe that hatred and anger is a sustainable fuel, that you can continue to fuel movements by hatred, and somehow that will be sustainable. But to me, the teachings of nonviolence point to the universal truth that hatred is actually not sustainable fuel, that you cannot create lasting peace by using violence. And so nonviolence is, to me, it's largely the science of how we heal, the science of how violence impacts us as a species, not as like leftist and progressive, but as a species, and an understanding of how we heal through that and move towards beloved community and reconciliation. And so it's the same with Dharma, same with physics. It's something that we'll never know all of. It's something that we continue to have to practice and to study to develop a deeper and deeper understanding of each day. And so um, I'm grateful to share some space with you all today to try to deepen all of our understanding a little bit. So yeah, thank you for your time, and I'll pause there and turn it back over to I don't know if it's Barbara or Reverend Hitton, and open up with some discussion, some questions.
Yeah, well, I think it's me at this point. I encourage everyone. This is not something where it's just the panelists being engaged in conversation. So we are encouraging each and every one of you to place a question in the Q&A and to lift up anything in the chat area that you would like to present and have dialogue about. I will start with this question. Should we be making an urgent efforts to offer nonviolent training as the best response to rising threats of violence and even civil war in the US?
Yeah, no, absolutely 100%. One of the movements that I've been greatly inspired by is the Otpor movement, which was the student-led nonviolent revolution that brought down Slobodan Milosevic. And one of the reasons why I admire them so much is because in the 2 years of their struggle, they put something like 50,000 people through a week-long training in nonviolence. Like the majority of the people who had any active role in that movement were trained in nonviolence, which is why they were able to maintain the fierce nonviolent discipline that allowed them to overthrow the dictator. And yeah, I think the nonviolence that I want to see manifested in the world cannot happen by attending a 2-hour workshop. It has to happen through deep understanding and commitment and practice in nonviolence. And that doesn't mean that everyone in the world has to go through that. I was talking with Dr. Bernard Lafayette years ago, who is one of the elders from the civil rights movement that I have the privilege to have learned a lot from. And he said that, most people who participated in the civil rights movement weren't committed to nonviolence as a way of life. They were only committed to nonviolence as an effective strategy to accomplish their goal. But all of the leadership of the movement understood that nonviolence was a way of life. And because the leadership was so committed to that depth of nonviolence, that commitment kind of spread throughout the entire movement, even if every individual didn't believe in it. And so I think it's really important for the leadership of movements to be deeply embedded in this worldview of nonviolence, and then for that leadership to be offering mass trainings to people, perhaps not in the depth of nonviolence as we understand it, but at the very least in the effectiveness of nonviolence as a strategy. The work of Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stefan have been really, really influential and helpful in kind of spreading the teachings of nonviolent civil resistance. And there's a lot of resources like that. But yeah, I think it's really, really important for us to really increase our capacity to offer nonviolence trainings. Like people need to be trained in this stuff. Reverend James Lawson, the kind of the godfather of nonviolence in the United States, says that change doesn't happen spontaneously. It happens systematically through intense strategizing and intense training, right? And we can't underestimate the intense level of commitment and training that it takes to create social change.
All right, good question and answer. I'm Reverend Denise Norfleet Walker, pastor at St. Paul Praise and Worship Center and Eldersley St. Andrews. It's good to see you again. See you again outside of the day, but to match you with your book. And we have a question, and I'm going to say when this is, it's going to be nonviolence. And so the question is this, and I'm going to think this is nonviolence, Kenyan nonviolence, primarily a spiritual practice? If so, what is a good daily routine? Readings, self-exam.
Yeah, it's a good question. And I want to be careful again about the use of the word spiritual, just because some people are turned off by that, right? Um, I'm actually working on a section, and I'm working on another book right now, and I'm working on a section where I talk explicitly about that. And again, talking about how, to me, the word spirituality just means deepening in an embodied understanding that we belong to something greater than ourselves. I think that is a really important component in the way I understand nonviolence. Um, that once we can have this embodied understanding that we belong to each other, that we live in an interdependent world. Dr. Martin Luther King, he's got this famous quote that we are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality tied by a single garment of destiny, that what affects one person directly affects all people indirectly. And again, it's one of those things like, if you don't know better, that almost sounds like a Buddhist teaching. But Dr. King was a Southern Baptist preacher, and he also arrived through his Baptist training to the same conclusion that we are deeply interdependent and that I cannot be free until all people are free. I think that understanding of interdependence is really, really critical if we are to have this unwavering commitment to not demonize people, to always look at injustice and violence as the enemy and not people as the enemy. And that even the people who are inflicting harm, it's by creating space for them to be healed and for them to be liberated that all of us can then be liberated. Um, and daily practices, if we understand nonviolence as a martial art, there's different like colored belts, right? So if you're new to the practice of nonviolence, then a daily routine might be, like you said, reading something about nonviolence or practicing 5 minutes of what's called metta meditation, where you just sit in meditation trying to cultivate compassion for all people. And as your muscles of nonviolence become stronger, you can like graduate to different color levels or different color belts. In the back of the Healing Resistance book, I actually have in the appendix section, a section that I call the different weights of nonviolence, where I offer lots of practices of nonviolence that range from like 10 pounds to 300 pounds or whatever it was. And, as you increase your capacity to cultivate understanding and empathy, then you can increase your practices all the way up to doing really deep healing work around our personal traumas, or forgiveness work around with the people that have hurt us, or learning to have compassion specifically for the people that are most difficult in our own lives to have compassion around, stuff like that. So there's no shortage of practices that are out there. So yeah.
With the increased levels of violence that are going on in our world, this question has been posed rather for this evening. Gandhi said it was better to be violent than to be a coward in context of World War II. How does one determine in situations like World War II whether defeating Hitler with violence or conscious objection, or in independent struggles around the world, like the South Sudan?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Yeah, Gandhi indeed said multiple times throughout his life, he actually said this over and over and over, that people who use violence to resist injustice is closer to his understanding of nonviolence than people who just idly sit by and watch things happen. Because nonviolence was about having courage and about doing something, about making the personal sacrifice to engage in actions even at the threat of injury to your own body and to arrest and possibly even death. And so in that context, he said that he'd rather work with violent people than with people who are too scared to do anything, because at least people who engage in violence have the courage to risk themselves for the cause that they believe in. And he thought that that was actually closer to his understanding of nonviolence. And there's a mention of like independent struggles throughout the world. One thing I want to say too is, and this is something that I believe I touched on in my book, I think being a practitioner of nonviolence is never about casting judgment on communities who choose to use violence as their method of struggle. I think we need to acknowledge that violence can be very effective in keeping you alive and protecting your community from complete annihilation. And if that's what your community is facing, then if people choose to use violence simply to survive, we should never cast judgment on that, because violence can be effective in keeping you alive. Violence can be effective in overthrowing a dictator. But one thing that violence can never do is healing relationships and strengthening relationships. And to me, nonviolence is ultimately about that. It's about moving towards reconciliation, and violence can never get us that. Right? There's an incarcerated trainer that I work with at Soledad Prison in California who once said to me, resolving a conflict is about fixing issues, and reconciling a conflict is about repairing relationships. Resolving issues is about passing new legislation and getting a person out of office. And those are all important and critical things. But ultimately, if we're not also healing relationships, then there's always going to be new harm, always new conflict, always new division that leads to new injustice, new power dynamics, new instances of violence. And so at some point, we have to engage in struggle in a way that allows us to do more than what violence can. And I think that's what the exploration of nonviolence is. It's not about saying violence is always wrong, but it's about acknowledging that violence is limited and what more do we need. And so if communities feel like violence might be their only way to survive, then I'm not going to judge communities for engaging in violent actions. At the same time, I'll also add that as the research of Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stephan show, that if people are trained in nonviolence, then nonviolence can be even more effective in violence, even against the most violent regimes. But the challenge is that nonviolence requires more creativity, it requires more training, it requires more strategy and thoughtfulness than violence. Violence is a lot easier, it's a lot quicker. But therefore, it's also a little bit more temporary than nonviolence than nonviolence is. So, lots to say about kind of violence as a form of self-resistance or self-defense and resistance. But I'll pause there for now.
Well, Kazu, this talk tonight is really sending a lot of questions, and so that's a good thing. And so we're going to move on as quickly as we can. So our next question pertains, and you talked about that earlier, the intersection. And we understand that at the intersection, there are a lot of noises coming, and each wants to make sure they get heard and get through. And so with that being said, with so many interlocking crises and injustice at this moment in history, what do you feel would be some of the most effective approaches to creating change?
Yeah, so I guess I'll use this opportunity to put in a small plug for the second book that I'm working on now, which is called Fierce Vulnerability. And Fierce Vulnerability is largely about synthesizing the ancient lineage of nonviolence with some of the newer sciences around trauma healing. And, over the last 10 years or so, I've really been focusing a lot of resources of my own time into healing my own personal traumas of the things that I've been harmed by throughout my life. And in that journey, I've found, and not just my own journey, but been really involved in a lot of restorative justice and trauma healing work in the prisons. And through those journeys, I've really understood what it takes to heal personal harm and interpersonal harm. And as I've been doing that work, seeing so many connections between that and healing like social harms. And really seeing like one of the kind of $1 million questions that I've been asking in Fierce Vulnerability is, what would it look like if we viewed nonviolent direct action as a modality of collective trauma healing? That when we engage in the work of civil resistance, we're actually trying to heal collective wounds and collective trauma. And if you view direct action as a modality of collective healing, how might we reframe the ways in which we go about engaging in direct action, and some of the messaging that we use, and some of the framing, and some of the ways that we prepare ourselves to go into direct action? Um, Oftentimes in a lot of direct action spaces that I've been in, we prepare for direct action by kind of like rallying ourselves up. And in that escalation, I've noticed that oftentimes the more we escalate our tactics of nonviolence and nonviolent resistance, we tend to escalate this black and white worldview. Like a lot of escalated like front lines direct action spaces that I've been in is also the place where that like us versus them worldview is most escalated, where we're the good guys and they're the bad guys, and we're here to beat them, we're here to defeat them, we're here to overpower them non-violently, but we're still here to overpower them. And to me, that us versus them worldview is actually at the heart of what is destroying this planet, right? So how do we escalate our responses to harm? Because like the person who asked the question said, like there's so many escalated crises that we need to escalate our response so that it's the appropriate energy, the appropriate escalation. But at the same time, as we escalate our response, how do we do so in a way that we remember to breathe deeply so that we can stay connected to our prefrontal cortex, which is where empathy happens, which is where creativity happens, which is where nuance and complexity and long-term planning happens, right? So I think a lot of what I'm exploring right now is like a new generation of nonviolence trainings, where in addition to learning how to organize blockades and work with the media and things like that, we're also learning how to sing songs together, which is what they did in the civil rights movement. We're learning how to breathe together. We're learning how to support each other so that we can move through our own personal traumas. So we're not bringing those to the front lines and having our personal traumas be triggered and our commitment to nonviolence going out the window. And so I think one of the most important things that we can learn is to begin to have some sense of how trauma works, and to learn things like emotional regulation tactics, tools, as well as all of us committing personally to healing the traumas in our own personal lives. Like whatever that conversation is that you need to have with your family that you haven't had yet, figure out a way to move in that direction.
We have so many good questions, and so I'm a pick one that is sort of off of what everyone else has asked, so that we get a variety of what is going on. So the question asked is, how about nonviolence towards other species on the earth?
Yeah, no, absolutely. As I was sharing, this idea of interdependence can't stop at humankind. I think it's largely our separation with other species that had allowed us to destroy the Earth's ecology to the extent that we have, where we're now facing like mass extinction. And I think this is a whole other thing that I can go on and on and on about. And it's largely what I'm focused on in my second book too, is that like the depth of the crisis that we are facing, because of our lack of respect for the sanctity of all life, has gotten us to potentially the biggest crisis moment we have faced as a species in the history of our species. And there is something that is blocking our ability to grapple with the depth of that crisis. And most of us, even those of us who are engaged in social change work, kind of continue to go on as if we still have 30, 40, 50, 60 years in this work. And, one of my colleagues, Chris Moore-Backman, has been saying for years that he wants to write this article called Climate Honesty as Spiritual Practice, that for us to actually like be real with ourselves about the depth of the crisis we are in takes a certain level of spiritual strength for us to face the crisis head on and not completely collapse. And so I think that's where we are in the history of our species, is a place where we need to realize the depth of the crisis that we have gotten ourselves into. And that is largely the result of the fact that we have forgotten our interdependence with non-human species. And we continue to think that we can cause harm at unprecedented levels to non-human species and have that not affect our own psyche, never mind the actual like physical ecology, right? And so yeah, I think as we continue to deepen in our practice of interdependence, it can't just be about like the people that are easy to love. It has to extend to people who are difficult to love. And it also can't just be about compassion for our own species, but an understanding that if we don't liberate all species, then no species will ultimately be free.
All right. And we're going to move to one. These questions are so good. We're going to move to this one as you were talking about that part about nonviolence and its power. How do you feel about using words like target in the context of campaign language? And even if we don't use that word, do you have ideas about how to stay grounded in love, even as we pressure powerful decision makers, including major corporations, doing harm?
Yeah, language is so powerful. Right. I'm in Taiwan right now, so I'm in the process of learning Chinese, which is, by the way, is impossible. Um, but as I'm learning a new language, it's so clear that like we think with language, the way we frame things creates our worldview in ways that we don't even imagine. And so I think it is important for us to be looking at all of the language that we use. Um, while at the same time acknowledging that like I do use words like militant nonviolence, right? Because I think there is power in reclaiming some of that language. So I think it's a case by case, right? I think words like target, if we're not careful, it can lead us into thinking that that person is our target. Um, but I think it's important as we organize nonviolent campaigns that we're really strategic. I'm oftentimes I often and I see the time now too, so I'll try to be quick here. I oftentimes get frustrated that like whatever instance of injustice happens, our tactic now is to just like occupy any random highway, and I think it's important to be a little bit more strategic than that. And I think in that case, using words like target to really figure out what the most strategic place where we can be going for our actions is important. And at the same time, I think it's really important that we make it clear that our targets are not people. Our target is injustice. And one of the things that can really help with that is by looking at people who we may think of as our target and to try to understand their story. I have this theory that the more we understand people's story, the more everything they do begins to make sense. And it doesn't justify or condone what they're doing, but it begins to make sense, right? Like in all of the work that I've done in the prisons with people who have caused an incredible deal of violence, the more I hear their story, it's like, oh, of course you did what you did. I don't agree with what you did. What you did was violent, and there needs to be a process of accountability and healing, but I get it. And so when I look at, people like our former president, as someone who's done a lot of work in the trauma world, like I see a deeply traumatized person. And through that, I can begin to have a little bit more compassion for him while acknowledging that we need to do everything we can to stop the impact of everything that is coming out of his mouth. Right. So I know we're out of time, so there's a lot more to say, but I'll stop there and pass the mic back to you all.
I cannot begin to thank you enough. We still have questions in the queue that people really want to get to, but I'm going to turn this over to Barbara right now because we have some possibilities for getting some of this dialogue continuing and the possibilities of what we will do in the way of training. Barbara?
Okay, thank you, Del. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Kazu, so much for taking time to share these words with us. We really appreciate it so much. I just want to wrap up really quickly to let you know, now that your whistle is wetted, that there are some things to do to learn more. First off is to buy the book. And secondly, it looks like my slides are not coming up. So I'll just have to tell you that in January, we will be, this group, Baltimore Peace Builders, will be hosting a book discussion of healing resistance on 4 Wednesday nights beginning January 12th. We have, I should also say, we have this talk recorded. We have your questions recorded, and we will find a way to share them with you. And we have your email addresses. For another training opportunity, I want to let you know that the Kingian Nonviolence Core Training, the 2-day training, which actually now takes more days than that over Zoom, will be starting up. And there's another session that begins on January 22nd on Saturday mornings, Eastern Time. That training includes the 4 pillars of Kingian nonviolence, its social dynamics, the principles. Oh, there we go. Okay, thanks, Luke. That must be you who's making that happen. So there's the, for registration information, this is where you want to go. Head out to the KingianOnEarthPeace.org website. There is also a Kingian Nonviolence Network on Facebook, which you can check out. There are a couple other places to go for immediate sources. The Kingian Nonviolence Network features Kingian nonviolence. Also nearby, our neighbors to the south in DC, there's a very active DC Peace team, which does a host of kinds of trainings. They've been online for some time. And so there are, as Kazu had indicated, many ways to begin to practice and learn more. If you make this a lifelong commitment, there's lots and lots and lots to learn. So we just missed a series of introductory sessions on December 12th, but stay tuned at DC Peace Team, and they offer things every month. There are several Kingian nonviolence centers around the country. I've listed 2 here, Selma and Rochester. They also offer trainings. You can see how they bring their work out into the world in their locations. So that is just a few things to get you started to move on down the path of learning more about nonviolence as praxis. Before we wrap up, I just want to say thank you very much to the woman behind the curtain, who is Carrie Graves, who has made our tech things happen. And then you've seen 2 amazing women in front of the curtain, Pastor Del Hinton and Pastor Denise. So thank you all very much for joining us. Be in touch if you'd like the transcription or the recording. And we hope to see you again as we do some Baltimore peace building. Be well all.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kazu.